morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name is Ross, and as always told, out of Voice Radio, and yesterday we had day one of the Pokemon Trading Card Game World Championships 2019. So I thought we should have a look at what we learned. Let's have a look at some takeaways. And one of the biggest takeaways for me all stems from Custom Catcher. Now, there are a couple of points here. First of which, of course, Custom Catcher was everywhere. Custom Catcher got played in a huge amount of decks. I believe the majority of decks on stream featured Custom Catcher. It is an item card, and if you play one, you get to draw until you have 3 cards in your hand, a decent little consistency boost. But if you play 2 at the same time, you get to drag one of your opponent's bench Pokemon into the active. The thing is, we lost Guzma to the rotation. And we lost Counter Catcher and pretty much all of our good gusting options. So we ended up playing Counter Catcher. And as well as Custom Catcher being a really good card, the other takeaways here are, it is much, much harder to gust Pokemon off your opponent's bench than it used to be. And it's still as good as it ever was. We saw Robin Schultz in the first round of the stream playing Ninetales. Ninetales is an annoying gusting Pokemon. It's a stage 1, you have to discard 2 fire energy from your hand. Nobody's arguing that Ninetales is even remotely a good replacement for Guzma. It's just the only replacement we've got. Now the background here is that we just had the rotation. Literally as Worlds was starting, we had the rotation. And that means that a whole bunch of sets were no longer legal. We went Ultra Prism on. Add on to that, the fact that Unified Minds just became legal for tournament play for the very first time. And both of those came together. Both of them happened at the same time. And that made everything very, very, very different, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we end up with stuff like Custom Catcher. And expect to see this a lot more as we go through day 2. Gusting is still key, it's so much harder to do, and Custom Catcher's probably the best way to do it. The other thing we saw is that it was a GX party. We saw a whole bunch of Pikachu and Zekrom. We saw a bunch of Reshiram and Charizard. We saw a weirdly large amount of Gardevoir and Sylveon, more on that deck in a moment. And the reason is, Pokemon search options were just not very good. And GX's just got Cherish Ball. Cherish Ball allows you to search for a Pokemon GX, put it into your hand. Now it wasn't just that. We also saw the Mysterious Treasure, saw a bunch of play for Psychic and Dragon decks. We saw that Electromagnetic Radar was good for Lightning decks, although again that actually only searches out EXs and GXs, not your ordinary everyday Pokemon. We saw that Ultra Space saw a bit of play for searching out your Ultra Beast exactly as expected. But all of these decks are GXs, even Mysterious Treasure. You're looking at stuff like Ultra Necrozma, like Garchomp and Giratina. Ultra Space, you're looking at stuff like Blacephalon or Naganadel. There just aren't that many good non-GX decks that we can make use consistently. Really, there were 2 relevant non-GX decks that we saw during day 1 of Worlds, and that was the non-GX Malamar list, because you could use Mysterious Treasure, so when you were searching out those cards like Giratina, you had a searching option, and Beheeyem. Now, Beheeyem is a deck that's going to get its own video in the not-too-distant future, but Beheeyem basically was good because it revolved around using Pidgeotto as a bit of a draw engine, and Pidgeotto has 60 HP, so you can use Professor Round's Lecture. So you could get all of your basics and your Pidgeotto using Professor Round's Lecture. You can then find your Beheeyem using Pidgeotto, and that's how it worked. And that was one of the huge issues we saw, and it's one we expected. Searching Pokemon was way more difficult, and GX decks have a huge advantage. And both the non-GX decks we saw making waves really did have decent Pokemon search options, Whereas stuff like Garchomp, which I still think is a really good deck, just didn't. I think Garchomp's amazing. It can hit 260 for essentially a single energy, and it's got free retreat. But it's a stage 2 that doesn't have great options for being searched out. There was no way it was going to make waves at Worlds, and that makes me legitimately sad. We also saw that Reset Stamp was nuts. I've been telling you since the day that Reset Stamp was revealed that this card is going to absolutely take over the format. I've shown you so many Japanese deck lists on this channel since Reset Stamp was legal for play over there, which was a few months ago now. And they all have Reset Stamp in. Reset Stamp forces your opponent to shuffle their hand into their deck and draw a number of cards equal to their remaining prizes. Essentially, any time your opponent gets a bit of a lead in the game, or any time you think your opponent's got a good hand, you play this to get them down. They KO your tag team GX, this instantly puts them down to 3 cards in hand. They play Steven's Resolve so that you know they've got 3 good cards in their hand. This gets rid of those 3 cards and gives them a new hand. Make no mistake about it, this is in, I believe, every deck, if not pretty much every deck. I believe it will be in every deck in Day 2, sincerely. And I don't just mean Day 2 of Worlds, I mean going forward. Reset Stamp is nuts, and it is very much here to stay. The other thing we saw an awful lot of was healing. Healing hasn't been a particularly big deal in the format lately. And the reason we've not seen healing is a few reasons. Firstly, we've had stuff like Choice Band, so it's easier to get one-hit KOs. Secondly, we've had stuff like Guzma, which means you can drag Pokemon off the bench before they've had a good chance to heal. And thirdly, we've had Ace Roller, which allows you to pick up a Pokemon if it's about to be KO'd. And what we saw this weekend was a lot of healing, or at least in Day 1. We saw Great Potion being played in GX decks because it heals 50 damage. That sounds pretty good to me. We saw Mixed Herbs being played. Now, to be fair, there were a few people who had started playing Mixed Herbs in some Reshiram and Charizard list pre-rotation. But you play 1, you remove a special condition. You play 2 at the same time, you heal 90 and remove all special conditions from your active Pokemon. And I know that cards like Custom Catcher and Mixed Herbs might look awkward to use, but Green's Exploration was seeing play in basically every deck that doesn't play abilities. If you got no Pokemon to play with abilities, search for any 2 trainer cards, so that made it much easier to actually get this rolling. And we saw people playing Super Scoop Up, which is kind of like Ace Roller, except you need to actually flip a heads in order to use it. But we've got fewer one-hit KOs, and we got less chance of dragging a Pokemon off the bench when they're being 2-hit KO'd, and this adds up to a format where healing is a lot more relevant than it was before. Now, everybody always wants to know what the Japanese players are bringing, and I'm not saying every single Japanese player brought it, but it seems like the most common deck brought by Japanese players was Gardevoir and Sylveon. 260 HP, a first attack that accelerates energy, a main attack that does 151 moving your energy around if you want to, and a GX attack that makes your opponent shuffle their entire deck into their hand. You play it with stuff like the Fairy Charms. It blocks attacks of GX or EX Pokemon of the relevant type. So Fairy Charm Lightning will block attacks from Lightning, EXs and GXs, like Pikachu and Zekrom. And they play stuff like Choice Helmet to reduce damage and those healing cards we mentioned, and very difficult if you cannot get a one-hit KO on it. That was what the Japanese players were generally tending to bring. Although, incidentally, this saw so much more play than I was expecting. Assuming you don't separate all the different Malamar decks out, this was the 5th most popular deck, which is ridiculous. We all knew it was a good deck, but I did not expect it to quite come around in that kind of ridiculous number. Now, speaking of the metagame, the lovely Kenny Wisdom, one of the casters at the event this weekend, did tweet out an image showing how the metagame actually broke down. You can see that there are 3 colours there. The first is Master, the second is Senior, the third is Junior. So the most played deck was Pikachu and Zekrom, But in this list, all the Malamar decks are split up. You got Malamar with Garchomp Giratina, you've got the non-GX Malamar with Giratina, and then you've got Malamar Ultra Necrozma, and honestly, it's really hard because there's a whole bunch of overlap. We saw in the final round of stream, Yamato, he was playing Malamar Giratina, but he had one Garchomp Giratina in there. If you add up all the different ways of playing Malamar, Malamar is by far the biggest deck. Pikachu and Zekrom is number 2, and then we saw Blacephalon, Naganadel, and Reshiram and Charizard seeing a bunch of play. And then, like I mentioned, Gardevoir and Sylveon. And you'll notice that it's very top-heavy and it peters out very, very quickly. You'll also notice that if we look down the list, until you get down to Other, the only deck on that list that isn't a GX-heavy deck, and a primarily GX deck, is Malamar Giratina, which often techs in 1 or 2 tag teams anyway. It was an absolute GX fest. Though we did see Behem doing rather well. I should give that one its own video. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. Those are some of the takeaways, some of the lessons, some of the things you need to know from day 1 of the Pokemon Trading Card Game World Championships 2019. Don't forget to make sure you're subscribed here, because I'm going to be bringing you all the news and analysis all weekend. Anything you need to know about the World Championships, I'll be there for you. But I'd like to know what you noticed about the Pokemon TCG World Championships already, so let me know in the comment section. Go nuts! Be nice. And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at TheWasi, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all that, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. And please do make sure you're checking out youtube.com/WasiPlays, where we talk about a whole bunch of games that don't even have any Pokemon in. But by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves till next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.